Hey guys, so before we actually get started on the video for today, I just kind of wanted to go over these notes that you guys might have seen in the lesson plans or download it and kind of explain what to do with these. So as we go through the video and I start talking about the different groups or classes of invertebrates, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be filling out this little chart here. So you can see that for at least three of the groups that we're going to be talking about today. We're just going to be talking about these four, but for these three groups, you already have the group name. For one of them, you already have an example here, you have an example down there. You don't have the examples here yet, which means that as we go through each one of these, you're going to be writing those down. So for Porifera, we know it's a sponge. Maybe you're going to write down a different example of a sponge. For Cnidarians, all right, what are Cnidarians? If you've done your reading already, you should know that Cnidarians are things like jellyfish, so maybe you're going to write that down there in the notes, and some of the others, because there's more than just jellyfish in this category. Then you're going to go over here to where it says characteristics. One of the characteristics of Cnidarians are that they use nematocysts, and we are going to be talking about nematocysts in this video, and so you can understand that. But there's also other characteristics besides these nematocysts, so make sure you write down several characteristics at least. The same for your sponges, and then for your flatworms, and then for this category, I will tell you the group, you'll see it when we get to it. But again, make sure you're writing down, filling in the group or the class, the examples, and characteristics. Alright, now back to the show. Finally, the lesson that you've been waiting for. We finally made it. After most of the year, we're finally starting to talk about zoology. Now, zoology is just simply the study of animals. It can be any animal, from amphibians to fish to mammals to birds to even insects. And what you see here is just kind of like just a few different examples out of literally thousands and thousands and possibly even millions of different examples of what is studied in zoology. So zoology is just the study of animals, and that's what we're actually going to be doing. And this whole chapter is about one group of animals in particular. And so we're going to go ahead and just look at the animal kingdom. Going to take a bird's eye view of it. So you can see on this chart here all the different large groups of animals classified. When we think of an animal, maybe we think of something like you see in the picture there. Maybe you think of like an elephant, or a crocodile, or a fish, or a zebra, a lion, etc., etc. However, what's grossly misrepresented here is the lack of butterflies, the lack of spiders, frankly, the lack of anything that doesn't have a backbone. I mean, look at our chart here. Right? This represents all of the animal life on Earth. In the textbooks, if you guys did your reading, you read how invertebrates alone are going to make up 95% of all animal life on Earth. And just look at this chart and that proves it. Alright? Now, how does it prove it? Well, first of all, we have to understand what is an invertebrate. Alright? Simply put, invertebrates are animals that lack a backbone. Look at our jellyfish, look at our lobster, look at our tardigrade, which is like a water bear. Look at our sea star, our planarians, our earthworms. None of these creatures have a skeleton like we do. And so we, and other animals that have skeletons are a rarity within this animal kingdom. We fit in this tiny little spot right here. All the mammals are right there. Then you have your amphibians, you have some reptiles, you have some birds, and you have surprisingly large amount of fish. Fish and birds are actually the most diverse of all the animals that have a backbone. But even still, look at all these animals that have a backbone. Now compare that to the rest of our chart here. Alright, if this was like a pizza and you were given this tiny slice, you would say you were not given a lot, and you would be correct. And here's the other thing about this, guys. This 95% here, that's all invertebrates, this 95% is what's going to be covered in this entire chapter. And so this chapter is going to take us a little bit longer than usual, and we'll be on some of these invertebrates for a while, simply because they're important, and I find them really interesting, and I think they're often overlooked, and so we're not going to be doing that. And especially when you look here, these are probably some of the invertebrates that we are used to knowing about and seeing, insects and things like that. We're probably going to look at insects next week or the week after, but we're going to spend some time on them. Then you have your arachnids. Those are your things like your tarantulas, your scorpions, and then you have all these, you have your crustaceans, and then you have all these other ones that maybe you wouldn't think of. And it's these other weird, random ones that we're going to be talking about today. So let's go ahead and let's just get started on talking about the invertebrates. Alright, so before we get going on talking about the different groups of invertebrates, one thing I want to talk about is symmetry. And in biology, symmetry is simply how you can divide something up into equal parts. So here you can see like this lobster here, he has bilateral symmetry. Bi meaning two, lateral meaning that you can cut him on this lateral plane, you can do a lateral cut, and it's going to divide him into a right and a left side. Alright, it's going to divide him into two parts, so that's that bilateral symmetry. We would be considered a creature that has bilateral symmetry because we have a right hand, we have a left hand, a right foot, a left foot, so on and so forth. If you were to cut somebody down the middle or do like an imaginary line, it would be pretty equal on both sides. So that's bilateral symmetry. Radial symmetry, however, is where you could cut it this way, and you're going to have two equal halves like bilateral symmetry, but then maybe you're going to cut it another way, where you're still now going to have four parts that are all still equal. And then maybe you're going to do it another way. So now you're going to have 6 different parts, but each one of those 6 parts is equal. In other words, this side is the reflection of that side, this side's the reflection of that side, or that side, and that side's the reflection of that side. Alright? That's what radial symmetry is. It can be cut a lot of different ways and still show that symmetry. And then last but not least, we have asymmetrical. And again, this prefix here comes up a lot in our biology, a meaning not, symmetrical. So not symmetrical, asymmetrical. In other words, an animal like this, which is a sponge, you could try and cut it in half, but even just trying one cut, you're not going to get 2 equal parts. They're going to be different on both sides. Maybe if you tried 4 cuts, it's still going to be different on each side. You're not going to have that symmetry, so they're asymmetrical. Alright, this is going to be important moving on because this is one of those characteristics that we use to help us classify organisms. Some of them will have asymmetrical body plans, some of them will have radial symmetry, and then others will have bilateral symmetry. And the first of these that we're going to be talking about has asymmetrical. And that is the sponges, or Porifera. Now, this word right here, so on your papers, the group Porifera. Porifera is its phylum name. Alright, if you remember our order classification, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, phylum is pretty high up there as being very, very broad. And so what that means is that there are lots of different genuses and species and families of sponges. Porifera is a very broad category, and we're going to see that as we move throughout, that what we're going to be looking at for the most part, at least this week, we're going to be looking at phylums. We're going to be looking at these really large groups of invertebrates, and then we're going to start to take some of them and break them down into classes later on. All right. So what do we need to know about phylum Porifera? Well, we know it's an animal, which means that it's going to have multicellular structures and it's going to have to eat somehow. It's not going to be able to produce its own food. And occasionally it may move. Now, sponges are not going to be like SpongeBob here. Sorry to burst your bubble, but they're pretty much just going to sit in their place all their life. Unless they're a newly born, you could say, sponge, and they have the ability to kind of float or swim around a little bit more, and that's also how sponges can colonize large areas when they have their tiny little embryonic sponges that can float away. But in most cases, they're going to be they're going to plant themselves in place, and they are going to let their food come to them. And the way they do this, it's kind of like a vacuum in a sense. You see, they have these really important cells known as collar cells. All right, these collar cells are important, so make sure you have that written down in your notes that they feed themselves with these collar cells. And the way their feeding is going to go about, it's going to be filter feeding. And so what happens is they have these little flagellas on the end of their collar cells. And all these collar cells line the inside of our sponge. If you notice also, our sponge has like a little hole up here that's called the osculum, and that's actually where water will flow out. And so what's happening is as these sponges, these little flagellas are kind of rotating around like a little whip, they're creating this current. And this current is actually sucking in water from the outside of the sponge, and it's going to bring it all in. And as that water is being filtered through the sponge, this little collar here is filtering all these particulates. It's getting all this microscopic organisms like bacteria or protists and algae, and it's going to use those as nutrition. And so that's how it's getting the food. And so once it gets its food, it pushes the water through the osculum and out. And I believe there's even a little clip that I have down in the description that you can go watch that for yourself, and you can see how it brings it out almost like a little chimney stack. And again, like I said before, these are asymmetrical. They have no symmetry simply because they just grow in weird shapes. Your sponges don't look like SpongeBob, alright? Sorry to burst your bubble again. Up next are the Cnidarians. The C is actually silent. You don't pronounce it or anything. It's just Cnidarians. And the most common Cnidarian that we all think of are the jellyfish. But these also include our corals, hydras, and our sea. And so all these creatures are actually considered Cnidarians. Now, what classifies them as Cnidarians, even though they might look so different, it's all their characteristics. So first of all, they're going to have two different main body types. They're either going to be a polyp, which is what your things like sea anemones, your corals, and even these little hydras are. They're going to be what's called a polyp, or they're going to have a medusa body plan, which is what your jellyfish are. But nonetheless, medusa body plan just kind of means that, you know, it has this umbrella shape at the top and it has these tentacles, whereas a polyp is going to just kind of have this body plan here and the tentacles up top close to its mouth. They all have tentacles close to their mouth, whatever they are. Even these corals, they might not look like it, but these corals are actually colonies of microscopic cnidarians. This one coral, for example, or let's talk about this green coral. This green coral here is made up of thousands of individual coral animals. And they make this little exoskeleton to protect themselves, but they're kind of like a polyp, like this sea anemone. And so the way their body plan works is they basically just have a mouth, and that's it. They're basically like water balloons with a mouth. And that's all they have. They don't have any other place for things to go. So when they eat stuff and then they start to digest that stuff, once they are done with it and they've digested all they can, everything else goes out the same place it came into. And so that's another thing that happens with these Cnidarians. Now, they do have two main tissue layers. They have kind of like this layer that protects the outside, and then this inner layer, and in between the two layers, they have kind of like this jelly-like fluid. That's also why they get the name jellyfish. But it's what we'd call a hydrostatic skeleton, all right? Because of that water-like substance, that's what hydro means, that's why we call it a hydrostatic skeleton. Because just as if you were to fill a water balloon and that water would give it its shape, that's how these animals have their shape, is with the water that's inside of them. Now, another fact about these, you could say that most of them are found in marine environments, in other words, saltwater environments, but these guys right here, they are so cool. They are probably one of my favorite Cnidarians, even before all these other guys, because these guys can actually be found basically in any fresh body of water. For example, the little retention pond outside of our classroom. I've found them in there before. I've found them in my pond before, and they are super cool to look at and watch under a microscope. And if you look down in the description of the video, I have linked a video to one of these guys actually eating a mosquito larva. And so they're going to do it just like all these guys are going to. They're going to use their tentacles, and they're going to bring their food into their mouth. Now, how are they grabbing onto things with their tentacles? Well, it has to do with the specific type of stinging cell called a nematocyst. Alright? And if you read about the nematocyst in the book, you might have seen how they're like these little harpoons. And what happens is when they get triggered, they basically spring out and then they grab on to whatever organism is nearby, and they will also sometimes release a venom. Now, you may or may not have heard before, sometimes people say that the only way to get a jellyfish, their tentacles off you, is to actually have somebody put urine on it. And that's kind of like what they say. That is not true, alright? All you actually have to do is just run some fresh water over it, because what you're going to do is you're going to just kind of wash that nematocyst off. And so that's another unique thing about Cnidarians, is the fact that they have these stinging cells. If you guys remember, we talked about the protist and amoebas. I told you guys how one of my professors had her little song about if I were a butterfly, and she added the amoeba one in there. She also had one for the jellyfish and said, if I were a jellyfish, I'd thank you for my nematocyst. Because again, that's their little stinging cells. And so those are our Cnidarians. Just to recap again, these guys are going to have the radial symmetry, so you can cut this guy in half, then you can cut him half again, so on and so forth. Now you might look at these and say they don't have that radial symmetry, but again, we're talking about the individual organisms that live inside, not the entire colony. They're also going to have that hydrostatic skeleton, where it's kind of in between two tissue sacs, and they have their one opening that's surrounded by tentacles that have nematocysts to help them pull in their food and prey. Alright, now, the next two that we're going to be talking about today, and the last two that we're going to be talking about today, are often seen as parasitic, and there are a lot of cases where they are. In fact, if you have any pets at home, like a cat or a dog, I'm sure that you've had to give them pills before, like a heartworm pill, or just some other type of worm pill, or a dewormer. And these are the types of worms that we're talking about. We're not talking about the little worms that you get out of the ground, although these guys might live there. Uh, these are a different type of worm. And so one of the things I want you to take away from this today is the idea that when you say worm to a scientist or to a zoologist, that can mean a lot of different things. So it's important that we specify what type of worm we're talking about. So the first of these worms we're going to be looking at today are what are known as the flatworms. All right, so their phylum that these flatworms are found in is the Platyhelminthes. That's how you pronounce this. All right, this is the Platyhelminthes. All right, and so these Platyhelminthes include different uh, organisms like planarians, flukeworms, and tapeworms. The first one up, these planarians, that's what this guy is right here. And this is another example of a planarian. They kind of look like they have this weird face, and that's another thing that's unique about flatworms. This is where, again, if we're starting from simple to complex, this is where we're starting to see the complexity start of an animal or an organism actually having a face. Because this right here, they're kind of like little eye spots. And so let's go ahead and look at our Cnidarian down here. All right, or I'm sorry, our planarian down here. You notice these two yellow lines that are running laterally down its body. Those are its lateral nerves. All right, these nerves here attach to the top where we have what's known as a ganglion. And sometimes it's called its brain or a simple brain because what it is, it's like a cluster of nerves that are all together, and it kind of works for the processing and the thinky that has to go on for a little worm. And so there have been studies that have been done where people just simply, touch the worm. And when the worm moves, that lets them know, oh, you know what? The worm moved because he could feel it and he could sense it. So obviously there has to be something going on, some processing here, where it's not just that he can sense it, but then he can respond to his environment. And so this is where we're starting to see our nervous system get a little bit more developed as well. Our sponges, they don't have any nervous system really, and our jellyfish, they have some nerves that kind of help with the nematocyst, but they're not going to have a brain like this guy. And that's almost a stretch saying that even he has a brain, but nonetheless, it's there. And on top of it, what gives them this really weird look to them are these little eye spots. And what these eye spots do, they can't necessarily see pictures, but they can tell when the lights are on and off. So you could probably do this yourself. Like if your lights are off or your eyes are closed and your lights are off and then somebody turns the lights on, you don't even have to open your eyes to know that somebody turned the lights on because you can still kind of sense that and process that uh, through your eyelids. And that's basically all that the planarian sees is just this changing of light. And that helps them to know what time it is of day because that's important for them because they don't want to be out in the light. And so, again, it helps them sense around their environment. Now, I said we kind of have a head here, and in most cases you would assume that that's where their mouth would be. But on a planarian or any flatworm, it's not. They have what's known as a pharynx, and it's kind of like where your belly button would be. So imagine going to dinner and you have to eat everything through your belly button. That's how the planarians do it. And they have this pharynx here, and that pharynx kind of, they can shoot it out of their bodies almost and grab little organisms or things that come by that they need to eat. And once they do that, they're just going to take it and it's going to go into their gastrovascular cavity, this little kind of like digestive tract that runs the whole way down their body. It's going to be absorbed, and as it's absorbed through here, it goes to the cells that need those nutrients. And so that's how these guys are eating. Another unique thing or weird thing about these flatworms is that they are what's known as hermaphroditic. And what this means is that they can reproduce sexually, and when they reproduce sexually, they are going to have both the male and the female reproductive organs for their species. In other words, they're going to have like what would be considered your simple flatworm ovaries and the testes, and what happens is when the two flatworms will meet, they will fertilize each other's eggs, and that way, again, you're able to reproduce more organisms in a faster rate. And when you're a tiny little guy like that, that's important. And so that's why some organisms like this are hermaphroditic. And these guys are not the only ones that we will see that actually work that way. Another way that they could reproduce is through just kind of reconstruction, I guess you could say, in the sense that if you were to cut this worm in half, he would grow into two new worms. I'm sure you guys have heard that before with like earthworms when you find them, but that's not the case with earthworms. Earthworms you can't cut in half and they'll turn into two new worms. You just have one dead worm, alright? And so that's pretty much our flatworms, the Platyhelminthes. One final thing I want you to take away is that these planarians, they are not parasites, alright? You might even see a planarian from time to time in the soil or in the dirt somewhere, and that's fine. That's where they're supposed to be, or in the water. They're just one of God's creatures that's helping with decomposing and stuff like that. However, there are other worms that are parasites. The majority of flatworms will be parasites, and those are going to be ones like this, which is known as a fluke worm, or you have things like this, or even tapeworms. And I wish we were in class right now because I could show you guys. You guys know my little cabinet of curiosity in the front there. I actually have a tapeworm that came out of a cat, and you can see all the different segments on it, but they're a type of flatworm that's parasitic, and they live in the intestines of their host, and that's where most of these parasitic worms are going to live. Well, unless you're this parasitic worm. And I'm not going to play this video here, but the link is in the description. You can go watch it, and what happens is this is a type of flatworm that is a parasite. It actually has two hosts. The first host, where the eggs sort of incubate and everything, is going to be this poor snail here. And you can actually see the worms right here. Right where his eyes would be, those are actually worms inside of his eyes. And the worm kind of controls the snail to go where it wants to, and then which leads it to its second host, which is a bird. And so go ahead, watch this video, and it will show you how it does that. And so that leaves us with our final invertebrate that we're going to be talking about today.
Oh, nematodes.
So I'm sure you guys have heard the term nematode before. If not, I know you've probably seen it in SpongeBob or something. But they're not always like the little worms that you see in SpongeBob. These guys are what we consider roundworms. These are what the doctors or the vets worry about with your dogs with heartworm, things like that. And Ascaris is one of those that can be found in the intestines, and humans can get these too, especially if you are in a very dirty environment where it's not very clean. You can get these, pick up the eggs, and then they can start to parasitize inside, and they're just going to live in your intestines and wreak havoc, and that's not a good thing. You don't have to worry about that here, though, because, again, we're not a third world country, and so we don't generally have to worry about these things. But nonetheless, most of your roundworms are going to be parasitic in nature. And so those include the ascarisks, the pinworms, and the trichnia. And trichnia here, I just kind of want to talk about that one for a second. I find interesting because when I went to Philadelphia like 2 summers ago for a science conference, I got to go to this science museum, and one of the things that was there in that science museum was this little plaque about one of the scientists who worked there back in the 1800s. and he happened to be the scientist who discovered the trichnia worm and how it was transmitted from host to host. And he found that out while he was eating breakfast. Yes, while he was eating his breakfast ham, he noticed it was crunchier than usual. Being the scientist that he was, he thought to himself, I'm going to look at my ham under the microscope. And when he did, he found the eggs of the trichnia worm inside the muscle tissue of this ham. And so that led him to the realization that these trichnia worms were parasitizing these pigs, and when the pig meat wasn't cooked well enough, that's how these people were then getting infected with the trichnia worms. And so because of his crunchy ham, he was able to figure this out. And that's another reason why, like when you go somewhere, people say never eat undercooked pork. And this is one of those reasons why. So how do you know when you're looking at a roundworm? Well, first of all, it's not going to be flat, it's going to be round. Alright? But the other thing that's huge about this, whereas with our planarians, we just kind of had the mouth, and with our Cnidarians, we just had the mouth, and our sponges were just even filter feeding. These guys step it up a notch, and it's weird to think about, but this is a very important body structure for all of our other complicated animals moving forward, because now we have two openings. What that means is when we eat things, or when this worm eats things, all the waste no longer has to go back through its mouth. It does have an exit. And so here's where we start to see the the simplest form of a digestive system, you could say, in the sense of where we have like our mouth, our intestinal tract, and then everything leaves that shouldn't be there. So that's a huge other part of these nematodes, is that they were one of these first organisms that we're going to look at that has this. And so, with that being said, that's actually going to wrap up our notes for today. And one final thing, if you guys want to watch, I will put a link in the description to a video about the Acarus worms. And so, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the show Monsters Inside Me. You don't have to watch this if you don't want to, but I will put it there for you. I always like to kind of show you guys this is just one of those things. And the Ascaris worm is one of those parasitic worms that people can get. And so this just kind of talks about this. This lady recovered and everything. She's fine. But again, going to third world countries and things like that, you can sometimes pick these things up. And so it's always just good to know. And so with that being said, next week, what we will be looking at, and next time I talk to you guys, we will be talking about this guy. That's right, next week we're going to be talking about the worms that everybody thinks of when they hear of worms, and the worms that nobody thinks about when they really think about worms. And it's kind of a weird way to put it, but just think. Notice his body's in segments. That's because he is a segmented worm. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week, our segmented worms. So, I will talk to y'all later.
Thursday.